The king's shadow burned blue on the old stone when the torchlight struck the iron studs of his belt. Jon remembered that detail as clearly as anything, because it let him fix his eyes on metal and leather and cold rather than the weight of the question pressed between them. "Choose," Stannis said. His voice the scrape of a blade freed from a too-tight scabbard. Outside the door the wind gnawed at the tower like a hungry dog, and Ghost, white as wind foam, lifted his head from the door and showed the king his red eyes. To accept would mean breaking vows that had defined him since the day he stood in the frost with old Maester Aemon's hands warm on his own. To refuse would mean watching the north sink further into a winter ruled by flayed men. "I know what those vows cost you," Davos Seaworth had told him, soft as the sea. "I wore a king's law once like a chain. If it means more people breathe tomorrow because you break it today, well." He had turned the words over and over the way he had turned his white cloak over his shoulders at his election, weighing their heft, looking for the hidden hook. The hook was obvious. A man's honor had to be more than expedience. There would be men at the wall who would spit at his back until they died. But there were girls flinching from knives at Winterfell, and old men kneeling on broken knees at Dreadfort gates, and boys pressed into war by lords who called it duty and wore a flayed man for pride. There were sisters who had vanished into the world like smoke across a frozen lake, and a brother rumored to be a ghost on a savage island. And there were things worse than men that stirred beyond the wall every night and pressed their fingers through the cracks of the world. And Jon had seen their cold fire in the dark. "You cannot serve both," Maester Aemon had once said. "They require your whole soul. The wall or Winterfell, death or life." Jon had stood in the king's chamber in the king's tower with the torches burning low and the snow outside like sifted flour, and saw Davos watching him with a tired hope, and Melisandre watching him like a cat who had nosed out blood somewhere under the floorboards. Stannis did not watch at all. He stared through Jon as though a page had been placed inside him and the king was reading the shape of the writing. "Your Grace," Jon said, and in the moment he said those words, he knew a part of him would never be forgiven by brothers in black. "If I take a name, it will be to keep the North alive through the longest night. If I take a castle, it will be to keep watch still, only from a different wall. If I am to be Jon Stark, I will not forget the man who was Jon Snow." Stannis nodded once and did not smile. "Then kneel," he said. Jon knelt, and the floor's cold bit through his breeches. He felt the weight of Melisandre's stare between his shoulder blades, and the air tasted like iron. Stannis drew steel, the sound thin as ice breaking, and laid the flat of the sword on Jon's shoulders, left and right. "Rise, Jon Stark," the king said. "Lord of Winterfell by my grace, with the charge to keep my peace in the north and bring these lands once again beneath a true king." Davos drew in a breath as if he had been underwater, and let it out softly. Melisandre's lips parted. Jon stood. His name felt like a knife that cut away half his life as easily as a sleeve. Ghost stepped close, shoulder brushing his knee. The touch steadied him. He knew, with a clarity that had nothing to do with logic or law, that some vows reached beyond the words men spoke in cold halls. The first vow he had ever made had been to a boy with a broken arm who dragged a wolf around in the mud and looked at his father's castle and thought it would never belong to him. Jon Snow had sworn to protect that boy's family in the only way he knew, which was to stand between them and the night. Jon Stark could do the same. The hard part began when dawn found the sky ragged and gray over the wall. The brothers of the Night's Watch filed into the great hall of Castle Black to take their morning meal, faces pinched from cold and thin from poor eating, and the fact of Jon's acceptance walked among them like a man with a loud laugh. Some would forgive him, many would not. Bowen Marsh's mouth became a line so thin it almost vanished from his face. Dolorous Ed glanced at Jon's shoulders as if trying to find the missing white cloak and then looked away, the way a man looks away from a wound that might be his own. "It was always a poor fit on you," Ed said later, by the ash heap, managing a crooked smile that hurt to see. "You wore it as well as anyone could. Don't come back if you wear another's colors. Men get confused then, like sheep when two dogs argue about the way home. I'll send food as soon as I can. Would too. And men," Jon promised. He spoke the words like a man piling stones into a river in flood. The river took most stones. He hoped a few would stand. Ed nodded. Food is good. Men are better. But wood makes a fire, and a fire makes a man remember he has bones. He sighed. You remember you have bones, Jon. Hard ones. Men will try to break them. Less fun than it sounds. Melisandre glided behind them, a smear of color in all that gray. He has more than bone, she murmured. He has iron in his blood and ash in his shadow. I have seen it burn. I have seen it melt ice. She turned her red eyes upon Jon and smiled without showing teeth. Serve the king, Lord Stark, and by him serve the light. Winter waits at your door. The door that day was called Alice Karstark. She arrived before noon with frost in her hair and a scarf iced stiff around her throat, riding a piebald mare so tired its ribs showed like a harp. The guards in black tried to turn her aside, but a girl who rides from Carhold in the dead of winter learns to shout loud. She shouted enough for Jon to hear, and when he came, she met him with eyes that were both desperate and proud. Jon Sn. Ow, she said, and then checked herself. My lord, I grew up hearing your name. You were the wolf who ran with the wrong pack. I still run with them when I can, Jon said. Come in. Warm yourself. Start at the beginning. She told him everything before the steam had fled the surface of her cup. Her uncle Arnulf had seized on her as a prize to embroil the Karstark name with the Boltons. A marriage to his son, the price of winter survival. Her father's son Harrion was taken far away, beyond her help, and every Karstark blade she had thought loyal now weighed which way the wind blew. Stannis listened as Alice spoke, the lines at the corner of his mouth deepening. When she ended, she sat very straight, hands clenched together in her lap. They can take my home, she said quietly. They cannot take what I am. I am Karstark. It is a Stark name. It does not bend. Jon liked her very much in that moment and, like liking often does, it made things harder. The marriage she'd fled might bind Arnulf to Winterfell's enemies. The marriage she might make could bind her to a hill of bloody stones if he was careless. There is another path, he said. Not the one men expect. There's a chieftain among the free folk, Sigorn. He is not a lord of old line, but he is brave and treated with respect by his own. With your consent, I can knit the Karstarks to a new strength. It would break the snares your uncle set and give Stannis allies who owe him nothing to the south. Stannis's eyes flicked, something like curiosity moving behind the iron of his face. You would spend wildling strength on Carhold? He asked. I would spend men's strength on the north, Jon said. Sigorn's folk have bled to stand with us. They need land and law. A pact with Carhold serves both. He turned to Alice. Is it your will? Her throat worked. You offer me a choice, she whispered, as if tasting the word. Then yes, on one condition. The choice is mine. It is, Jon said. Melisandre's laugh was soft. The Lord of Winterfell teaching the old houses new ways. How the wood will whisper about that. But she did not object, and later, when Alice stood with Sigorn before a Septon brother who stammered his way through vows he had never thought to speak for a then and a girl with blood like frosted steel, Jon watched the faces in the hall of Castle Black. Some were offended, some surprised. Crowd faces are coin. You learn to judge their mettle by the sound they make. The sound here was wary, but not empty. People liked to see something set right, tricked them into hoping. That night, with the wind quiet for once and the sky jagged with stars, Stannis summoned Jon again. Davos sat at the king's right, hands folded. Melisandre stood behind. A map lay on the table, and the candles made rivers of light crawl through the drawn rivers of ink. We march west first, Stannis said. Deepwood Motte is held by Ironborn. Robert Glover needs his home to break the Boltons' circling. From there, we move on Winterfell. And in the east? Jon asked. White Harbor, Lady Dustin, Last Hearth. We need their hearts as much as their blades. You intend to write to them, Davos said. It wasn't a question. Write to them, Stannis snorted. Words are wind, sire. Words are roads, Davos said carefully. If you know where to put them, Lord Stark may know. Jon set his hand on the drawn curve of the white knife and felt its cold under the paper. "Manderly has reasons to smile for the Boltons," he said. "Reasons that taste like fear and meat. He hides his pride under a belly. But his heart—" The Manderleys came north as guests of the Starks long ago. "The debt still bites." He tapped Deepwood Motte. "Robert Glover will follow his sister and Lord Galbart's wishes if he can. The Mormonts don't bend to the Boltons. They don't bend to anyone. They follow what is right as they judge it, sharp and cold as their island. Give them a Stark. Give them proof the old blood still flows in the halls. They will give you men." Stannis's eyes flicked upwards. "Give them proof," he repeated. "You think a proclamation from me will be enough?" "No," Jon said simply. "But a dire wolf at their hall will be." He felt ghosts' weight against his boot and knew that in the years to come, that one fact would open doors 100 seals could not. Stannis grunted. "Then let us give the North a show," he said. They moved in 2 echelons. The first west with the king and the mountain clans. Not Nori, little burly wool, hard men in furs whose spears knew the weight of elk and end of men. The second a web of ravens, the net Jon cast across White Harbor, Bear Island, Barrowton, the lonely towers by the Bar Rolands and along the Flint Hills. Alice and Sigorn rode with the king, the girl's eyes bright and her jaw set, and Jon watched the way the clansmen looked at her and the way Sigorn looked at the clansmen, each measuring steel in the other. The road to Deepwood Motte was a spine of ice through hills raw from winter. Trees looked like men caught mid-step and frozen in the act of running. Deepwood Motte fell like a rotten trunk kicked in the night. The Ironborn fought hard and dirty. Jon killed a man who wore a clump of raven feathers in his beard and smelled of tar and salt. He killed another who laughed as he bled. The laughter made him think of the nights he'd watched drunk men in the yard of Winterfell and wondered what ran in their heads besides ale. When the gate swung wide, Robert Glover strode through it from the inside, a man grown thinner than his proper size by worry and defeat and stubbornness. He looked at Stannis as one might look at a statue brought to life in an inconvenient shape, and looked at Jon as if dredging memory. When Jon's name was spoken, Stark this time, Glover's mouth twitched. "Your father was good to us," he said at last to Jon. "If you are half the man, we will be all the house." "I am as much my father's son as a bastard can be," Jon answered. "And as much as a Stark needs to be to keep you all breathing." "Breathing is good," Robert said roughly. "Breathing means we can sharpen knives tomorrow." Stannis left the garrison to the Glovers, set a handful of Queen's men to mind them, and turned his force toward Winterfell. The weather turned with him, a slow growl becoming a roar. Snow fell, then snow blew, then the sky became a gray animal and the air its fur, and the world contracted to 20 feet in any direction. Men cursed and horses drooped and sledges grew heavy. A dozen camp followers vanished one night as if the snow had bit them from the path and buried them without even a hump to mark their graves. The mountain clans, made from stone and pine and stubbornness, trudged on and scolded the wind as if it were a lazy child. Jon sent ravens from every stopping place. He wrote to Wyman Manderly in a careful hand, "Your lordship once feasted my brother and raised a cup to his army. The debt is not to me but to the north." He told him to expect Davos Seaworth, a man thinner than his honor and stronger than both. He wrote to Bear Island, "A wolf stands here again. If your words are the same as I remember hearing by Winterfell's fires, if your island knows only one kind of king, the kind with a northern name, then come." He wrote to Barrowton and Barbary Dustin and received in return a short, sharp letter shaped like her jaw and containing no promise at all. He wrote to the Serwins and Hornwoods and received promises shaped like weather, which is to say they varied. The letter to the Mormonts came back on a narrow scrap of tightly folded parchment. The hand was a child's, but the words were hard enough to cut. He smiled when he read it and showed it to Stannis, who scowled and snapped that little girls should mind their lessons. "They are," Jon said mildly. "That letter is a lesson to us." When White Harbor's answer came, it came by dispatch rider with blue lips who refused a chair, standing because what he carried seemed to brace him. "His lordship sent me day and night," the man panted. He said to ride as if the wolf himself was at my flank. Jon took the letter and broke the seal with a knife. He read it once and his eyes stung. He told himself it was the wind that followed the rider into the tent. Wyman Manderley had written with all the flourish of a man who loved the look of his own words and the taste of them on his tongue. It made the letters thicker where the pen had lingered. There were courtesies to Stannis, deferential but distant as a winter sun. There was a pledge to Lord Stark as long as Lord Stark remembered who he was and what name was carved into Winterfell's first stones. There were promises of men and ships, and there was one more promise, written carefully, likely more for himself than Jon. The North remembers. Jon folded the letter and said nothing, because all the words he might have used belonged to his father and were not his to speak now. Stannis said something caustic about fat men with long memories and longer lists of slights, but Jon saw the king's hand tighten on the table edge. He may have remembered the letter he had received from Bear Island, which said much the same thing in far fewer words. The snow forced them to abandon any thought of a straightforward investment of Winterfell. The Boltons had walls and grain and men with warm hands, bought with fear. Stannis had cold and anger and a handful of bright, dangerous ideas. They built fires low and fed them sparingly in a stand of dripping pines, and the king hunched with Jon over the map until the candle burned to a nub. "We cannot simply throw ourselves upon them," Stannis said. "The Freys march to relieve Winterfell. They will seek us in the open. Better we make a snare." Davos cleared his throat. "There is a crofter's village not far to the east, perched by a frozen river. Good ground for foot, bad for horse if the ice goes, and it will if we cut it. The Freys are proud in the saddle. Men freeze same as horses when pulled into a river," Stannis said, his mouth curving slightly. "Write the order." Jon studied the map, thinking of the men on both sides who would drown in black water under broken ice. He thought of the things that woke under ice when the black water covered a man's face and kissed it with the cold that did not let go. "We'll need more than one snare," he said. "Winterfell must feel alone. Is there a way to pry men from those walls?" "Starve them," Davos said. "Starving is slow," Jon replied. "This winter eats faster." What pried men from walls was not always hunger. It was the sense that the walls themselves disliked them. Jon knew Winterfell's stones. He had bled on them, sneaked across them, slept on them. Stone held memory, and Winterfell held a great deal of it. He closed his eyes and saw the circuit of the winter town, the smithies cinder black, the root cellars like mouth holes in the earth, the old crypts under the hill where kings lay with stone wolves at their feet, the hidden postern gate he had used as a boy on dares, a narrow door masked by a thorny tangle near the old weirwood. That door would be watched, but it might not be watched by men who had never grown up here, men who did not know how the snow drifted just so against that wall, always a foot deeper than anywhere else because the wind curled there. A man from the Dreadfort would miss that. A man like Theon Greyjoy, who had run Winterfell once like a thief who'd become master of a house without learning the names of its doors, would not miss it. The thought was ugly and necessary. "Reek," someone had whispered in the king's camp. A prisoner dragged in from the snows by some of Moore's Crowfoot's men, whimpering under a torn cloak, stinking of fear. The man had hidden his face in his arms when they'd thrown him down before the king, and Stannis's lip curled as if he had been offered carrion. When Jon took him aside later by the dying light of a watchfire, the prisoner lifted his head, and in the ruin that was left Jon found the glimmer of a boy he had once known, bright and arrogant. That light flared and went when Jon spoke his name. "I am not that," Theon said hoarsely. His teeth chattered. "The North ate me. Winterfell ate me. Ramsay chewed what was left. If you want the pieces, here." He spread his hands as if he might show Jon the inside of his chest if asked. Jon did not extend his hand. He said only, "Show me the paths. That is all I ask." A shudder went through Theon as if cold was working its fingers into his bones. Maybe it was only memory. "There is a door in the west wall under the thorn. He will have placed spears there. But in the snow you can crawl the sheep path by the mill and it will hide you from the barbican. And the tower stairs near the old rookery. They groan under a man's foot. You can tell the stones by the sound. They ring if a man sets his weight wrong. We used to, he swallowed. The crypts are worse. No one guards the dead, but the dead guard themselves, if you take my meaning. Men say they feel hands in the dark there. Boys go down to prove they are men and come up with white faces all the same. Jon nodded. He believed him. He had never felt hands, but he had felt the weight of eyes that were not eyes. The king's snare was set at the crofters' village. Arnulf Karstark smiled too widely when Stannis sent him with a spearhead to lure the Freys into the ice and was caught with a note from Bolton in his boot. Stannis sought his name from the list of northern houses as if it were a tumor and sent Cregan to share his father's fate. The mountain clans watched with the intent faces of men judging weather. They approved of swift storms that cleared the air. The Freys came as Davos had guessed they would, bright with pennons and arrogant on sleek horses that hated the snow. Stannis fought like a man who had never known warmth, every blow calculated to be the last a man needed. The ice broke where Davos wanted it to. The river roared like a dragon's breath below, and half the Frey knights went down with cries that began as curses and ended in bubbles. Hosteen Frey, red-faced and spitting at fate, charged and found the ice under him thin as the lies he'd sworn in prayer. When he came up again, he came up blue, quiet at last. After, the dead were dragged in a grotesque harvest from the river's black mouth and piled for burning, because the men in Stannis's camp knew what happened to the unburnt when the cold was deep and old. Melisandre stood with her hair unbound and her eyes alight as soldiers fed wood to the pyres. The dike of snow that had piled against Winterfell's western curtain was the height of 2 men and scalloped like a wave frozen in the act of breaking. The thorn bush hid the postern door as it had hidden it when Jon was a boy. Thorns break under ice and do not flinch. The watch on the barbican joked loudly to keep the cold from their ears. Men in flayed man livery stood with their backs to warmth and thought about the next bite of meat. A small thing saves a life or loses it. A man scratching at a louse under his collar looked up and missed the black shape slipping over snow because his eye litched and his finger forgot the world beyond his throat. Ghost went first, white on white, a ripple of shadow only when he moved. Jon followed, his limbs precise and careful, breath thin and measured as a cut. He counted heartbeats. He knew the stones by their feel under the pads of his gloves and the skin of his knees. Theon slithered behind him, a man remade into a knife willing to cut nothing except his own fear. A dozen mountain men came after, and Sigorn, and 2 of Stannis's queensmen who had volunteered with an eagerness that made Jon suspect they had debts to pay. Inside Winterfell, the cold lived in the walls, but the halls were warmer, and the warmth made the men inside soft. The corridor by the rookery groaned once when a heavy foot tested a stone. Jon flattened himself under a tapestry and felt the breath of the guard above him and remembered a boy peering out through wolf-worked cloth to see if a cook was looking. He had been a thief once with stolen pies. He was a thief now with stolen minutes. In the great hall, Ramsay held court with a girl by his side whose hands clenched the edge of the chair until her knuckles blanched. Jon felt the knife-straight ache behind his breastbone that saying the word sister had left in him for years now. He knew at a glance that this girl was not Arya. She was none of his blood. But she wore his family's name for the same reason a cut purse would wear a lord's ring: to open doors, to touch food set aside for someone else. Theon looked at her and shook. The shaking began in his arms and worked upward like a sickness. He leaned toward Jon and breathed into his ear a name not true but useful. Arya. Jane, Jon thought. He had an instinct for the truth of people's faces now, and this was a girl who had gone from small prettiness to plain by fear. Don't use her like a tool unless you must, he told himself. And then he told himself that everything he did now used someone like a tool. This is what lords did. When winter came and the men they commanded did not belong wholly to themselves anymore. The signal was a dropped torch at the east watchtower, a flare and a crackle, a handful of sparks falling like fireflies. Men ran toward fire because that is what men do when they fear other things worse. While they ran, Jon moved. He wanted a dozen things at once: to find the keys to the main gate, to reach the horn tower where the alarm was kept, to find the girl and pull her away from the flaying knife that was Ramsay's smile, to reach Roose Bolton's chamber and end this with a blade through a man who wore calm like a fur. You cannot hold 12 knives in one hand. Pick 2 and cut clean. The first knife was the gatehouse. Sigorn and the mountain men split left to climb the inner stairs to the crank wheel. Jon could count on their wrists. These were men who knew what it meant to put their backs into wood. The second was the girl. Theon did not ask permission. He moved as if pulled by a rope. Jon followed him because sometimes the right choice is to follow a man into the worst place. It tells your men that you do not ask what you won't do. Roose Bolton's calm unraveled late and all at once. It happened when a horn blew from the outer yard. Not the one kept in the tower, but a rough hunter's horn, half-cracked and too loud, and the sound carried over snow because cold makes the air a blade. The mountain clans were at the wall. Moore's Crowfoot's laugh came up under the horn, and that sound a man does not mistake even in a blizzard. Within, Fry men tumbled over benches, fighting their way to the door. Without, the wall's ice slick made ladders treacherous, and men in wool cursed as they fell. Ghost took a guardsman by the thigh and shook him like a hare. Jon let the man's dying cry be the third knife, because knives sometimes had to be ugly. The girl, Jane, who wore Arya's name, was in a side passage when they found her, a maidservant dragging her toward a stair that sloped down like a throat. The maid sold her with her eyes. She saw men in good armor and gave them the girl because it meant she lived another hour. Theon reached first. The girl flinched like a whipped dog, then went still, staring at his ravaged face. He whispered to her, and in that whisper was every wrong he had done and every day he had worn it like a shirt. Jon took her arm. "Quiet," he said. "Quick. Quick is a wish in a castle taken by storm." Men run toward shouts and smoke. Someone tried to light oil at the base of a stair and gave himself to the flames. The smell of burned hair filled the air in a way that never leaves the nose. The crank wheel groaned. The gate yawed open to the outer yard. Snow like 1,000 small knives came through the gap. Men from the clans poured through, their faces rapt and their eyes bright and hungry. Queen's men followed, and with them the king himself, a stubborn shadow that did not bend under the wind. Ramsay did not flee. He had the sense beasts have when the wolf is already in the pen with them. He turned and tore. The men closest to him died in a concealment of blood and snow, and he laughed once, high and sharp, a sound that would have fit better in a boy's mouth who'd learned to beg for bread by biting. Theon saw him and turned as if a string inside him had pulled taut enough to snap. Jon moved with Theon because he knew where the string led. Ramsay lifted the girl's name like a knife. "Wife," he called. "Come watch me skin a wolf for you." Jane covered her ears and sank to her knees. Theon's breath became a hiss. He had no fingers for a proper grip on a sword. He carried a dagger with a wrapped hilt, and he looked so thin the blade seemed as heavy as he was. He did not hesitate. He went in under Ramsay's swing the way a man ducks under a branch and drove his blade into the place where ribs part if the angle is right and fortune is bored. It should not have worked. It did, because men are not stories while they are happening. Ramsay screamed, a sound not princely, and pivoted with more force than a wounded man had a right to. He slashed Theon across the shoulder and cut him down to one knee. Jon stepped in then with a motion that had no flourish to it at all, the kind of practical killing you learn on a yard when you have been hit in the mouth before breakfast. He struck once. The edge kissed the side of Ramsay's throat where the skin shows the pulse. The blood came hot and steamed in the cold. Ramsay made a sound like an oath and like a cough. Then he fell. You can call it justice if you like. Enough men in that hall would later, and enough would call it only a death. And perhaps there is no difference in a winter as black as this one. Roose Bolton was found in his chamber with the door barred and his knife wet from someone else's throat. He died without spectacle because some men die like they lived, with minimum attention paid to anyone but themselves. The Queen's men who burst the door found him trying to smooth his face into a shape that might make a man pity him. It did not work. One of Manderley's men, a big fellow whose beard was stiff with rime, had brought a mailed hammer to the breaking and used it twice, once for the door and once for Roose. "Words are for the living," the man said, face unreadable. "Let the dead have silence." Winterfell opened like a clenched hand. The first light into the great hall struck men's faces and found the expression there not triumph but a fatigue so deep it was almost relief. You could not call what came next day feast. There was too little to eat, and every time a man lifted a mug, he could feel the night's cold around the edges of the warmth. It did not matter. They ate anyway, and every spoonful tasted like work they would not have to do tomorrow. Jon found himself in the Godswood without intending to go there. His feet took him the way an old horse knows the path to stable. He stood beneath the heart tree, and the face carved in it seemed to him both nearer and further than the last time. It had looked upon kings and boys and bastards and found all of them much the same. Ghost ranged along the frozen stream and showed his teeth at the wind. Jon set his palm against the weirwood skin and felt the cold run up his arm to his elbow and settle there like a bracer. He expected to feel relief. He felt only a deeper burden. The North was his now, inasmuch as a land belongs to a man and not the other way about. It did not matter that Stannis had set the title on him with steel. What mattered was that the people he could not name by sight still breathed because he kept them behind the idea of a wall, even if that wall had shifted from ice to stone. Stannis found him there. Kings should not walk without guards in halls where blood had flowed an hour before. But Stannis did a great many things he should not and was not shy about any of them. He looked at Jon and looked at the tree. His mouth took that prim set that might have been disapproval and might have been only discomfort with wood that was older than his own gods. "Your work is not done," he said. "There is White Harbor to bring in plain. There are Umbers split to sow. There are Karstark remnants to scour. There will be Lannister moves. There will be Freys trying to forget how the river took them. There is the wall," Jon said, "and beyond it, if we forget that, this will have been nothing but a prettier way to die." Stannis grunted. "Your thoughts run in ruts I sometimes find useful. I will not pretend I do not see your point. I expect you to raise men and bread and firewood. I expect you to keep winter from devouring my army. I expect you to do it with the least grumbling possible from men who were traitors yesterday and friends today. Can you do that?" He did not wait for an answer. "You can, or you will die trying. Either suits, as long as the North holds." Jon thought of another king, another look, kind, tired drollery, across a long table. The look of a man who would have loved this boy if the world had been gentle enough to let him. "I will keep the North," he said. He did not say for whom. Maybe it did not matter. A man who keeps a tower against a storm does not ask who claims the sea. Manderley arrived 2 weeks later with his banners like snowfields and his household knights as neat as knives in a chest. He put a knee down and got up with a grunt and kissed Jon on both cheeks with a fondness that made Jon uneasy. Then he kissed the girl who had been given Arya's name on her forehead and called her brave before everyone in the hall. And Jane cried for the first time since Jon had taken her hand in a corridor full of smoke. "I have brought you meat," Wyman said in that rolling voice, and clapped his hands. And across the yard they dragged in sledges piled with smoked pork and casks sealed with beeswax and sacks of barley that made men break into tears without shame. "And men," Wyman added. "And news. A king's hand came to me, thin as a net, and told me a tale that clutched my heart. I sent him to a place where hearts are torn out as a matter of course. If he comes back with what he seeks, you will have a brother in your hall and a wolf in your seat that no Southron can gainsay." "Davos?" Jon asked quietly. "Where?" "Skagos," Manderley said, and let the word sit in the air like a curse. "He will not like it. I do not like it. But if he brings back the boy, I will like that very much." Jon closed his eyes for one beat, afraid of hope because hope when it failed left a bone-deep ache that persisted past any healing. He opened them again to find Melisandre in the doorway, shadowed by firelight. She did not smile. She lifted one hand, palm out, and in the palm was a smear of ash. "You have taken your place," she said. "Now take your fire." He did not take her fire. He took her counsel when it made sense and ignored it when it did not, and he kept a wary eye on the way her gaze slid toward Shireen Baratheon and the way Queen Celis' mouth tightened whenever anyone used the little girl's name like a human being's. Shireen was sweet with a sadness that was difficult to bear. She moved through Winterfell as if she were visiting a museum in which every piece was breakable, and she had been told to keep her hands behind her back. Jon wanted to put warmth in her pockets and sunlight in her hair. You cannot give people what the world denied them. You can only offer them a seat near the fire and see that no one slaps their fingers when they reach for bread. The work of making a house breathe again is the work of 1,000 small decisions. The rebuilt winter town needed thatch and mats and stoves. The barns needed mending. The smithy's bellows had to be stitched and sealed. Children needed boots and grandmothers needed broth, and men needed to be told that they could do things for themselves and not for a lord's flattering smile. Jon moved through it like a man in a narrow boat steering between rocks. He set the Manderleys to rebuilding the river lock on the White Knife. He set the mountain men to the forests, cutting from stands that would regrow in 10 years, not 10 lives. He asked for men who knew the marsh to teach others how to cut peat. He paid them in fresh slaughter from the Manderley herds. He parceled out wood and wool to houses who had bent the knee with faces as stiff as the frost and kept a tally of it all so that no one could say later that he'd played favorites. He wrote to the Night's Watch again and again. He sent half of a ll he could spare in winter stores north, because men there had given him half their life once. Bowen Marsh wrote back once to say that wood and bread will be accepted, and also that I pray daily that the gods forgive you. It had the shape of an absolution and the taste of an accusation, and Jon put it in a wooden box with his father's last letter and the note lying like a worm in his pocket, which he had pulled from a tome in the library that spoke of kings and their bastard sons and the way the river of blood runs the course it chooses. Men came to Winterfell who had thought never to see its gates open to them again. Horsebane Umber came with his 50 and his grin as wide as the shivering sea and sniffed the air like a dog. "Smells like old family," he said, "and new stew." He thumped Jon on the back hard enough to stagger him and roared for ale until the rafters shook. The Cerwyns dug in like badgers and found themselves in the making of a new wall along the north-facing slope that would hold the snow. The Hornwood men sent a lean, quick-eyed boy to serve as their page, and Jon recognized something of himself in that boy and made a place at the table for him often, and asked him many questions and listened to his answers. He made justice under the heart tree because that is how the North breathes. It breathes through law and snow, and both are cold and both are necessary. He refused to cut off a man's head on hearsay, no matter how many neighbors pushed him, and he cut off another's with his own hand because that is what you owe to the law if you mean to practice it. He slept poorly, dreamed badly, woke often to ghosts' weight against his bed and the gust of winter under the sill. Sometimes, in the deep of night, he went down to the crypts alone with a lantern. The faces carved on stone did not change when the light passed over them. He would stand looking down at a woman with a long jaw and a sad mouth in stone, and he would imagine the hair color he had been told she had and the songs he had never heard about her. He did not know why these visits made him feel worse as often as they made him feel better. Perhaps a man goes to the dead not for answers but to hear his own questions echo back long enough that the noise feels like company. Stannis was not patient forever. He was patient as a blade left under snow that retains its sharpness for years, which is to say he waited exactly as long as it took to gather breath and soldiers and sledges, and then lifted his hand to draw the next cut. Letters came up from the Neck, from White Harbor, from the marshes near Moat Cailin, where trumpets had sounded across reeds and men in red cloaks had turned pink in the rain before they died. There would be another campaign in the spring, a push south to break the bones of what remained of the Iron Throne's grasp in the north. Stannis would lead it. He expected Jon to hold Winterfell and feed the army that went. "I will hold more than Winterfell," Jon said. "I will hold the wall, even if the Watch hates me for it. I will send men to Eastwatch. I will send men to Shadow Tower. I will set caravans from the Barrowlands and White Harbor as far north as human feet can drag a sledge. It will cost. It will buy everything worth having." Stannis's mouth twitched, which for him was a smile. "You will set my enemies' teeth on edge with this charity," he said. "Good. Let them gnash. It will break some of them." Word came of the wildlings, too, from Tormund Giantsbane, who had a gift for surviving and liked to prove it when there was an audience. He came to Winterfell with a handful of his people and 3 of his sons and a wife with fists like ham, and he stood beneath the flags and looked disdainfully at them and then smiled at Ghost because a sensible man admires what can rip out his throat from time to time. "You left us in a poor way, boy," Tormund said, not unkindly. "But you left it for something like a reason, and I am not angry. I do not waste anger on things that can't taste it." "I'll bite," Jon said. "I have sharp teeth today." Tormund threw back his head and laughed. "The North has been missing your kind of foolishness," he said. He slapped his chest. "I'll take my folk south if your doors are open. I will cut wood and haul stones and make bread with hands that have only stolen it. I will fight your enemies when they show their mean faces. But I will not bend my neck while I fight. That part of me is stiff and I like it that way." "Then don't bend," Jon said. "Bow to no man. Stand beside him." Melisandre watched the exchange with that distant expression she wore when she stared at flames as if they were a letter delivered by a king. Later she came to Jon and said, "The cold comes on cat feet and then on a roar. It will take the throat of the world if not checked. You think to check it with bread and wood and men's goodwill. All that is straw on snow. I have seen a place beneath the ground where the bones of the earth run close to the skin. The heat there is a kind of prayer." Her eyes flickered. "There are sacrifices that change the course of rivers." "You will not touch that child," Jon said. The words were a steel rod in his voice. "If you try, I will hang you from the same gallows as any witch in a story who thought a king's blood was her due." Melisandre studied him. For once there was something like respect in her gaze, unalloyed with hunger. "Sometimes," she said, "the light chooses a vessel unawares. Be careful what you forbid of the fire. It remembers." "I remember too," Jon said. "I remember what men looked like before they burned them. That is reason enough. When spring came it was not spring. It was merely a less absolute winter with days of sun that made the drifts crust hard enough to walk. Mornings where the breath did not immediately turn metal in the throat. Stannis moved south like a man pushing a heavy bar across a door. The phrase nipped and yapped and sometimes bit and sometimes bled. Jon kept Winterfell. He learned the shape of the castle again until he could walk it in the dark without a lantern. He learned the rhythms of men's wants. He learned how to tell a liar from a dreamer, and how to make use of both without breaking them entirely. And one day Davos Seaworth walked into the great hall with a little boy beside him who looked around with solemn eyes that took in banners and wolves and men with scars, and whose mouth trembled only when he saw Jon. He wore furs too big for him and a knife too small, and he had brown hair like a certain 8-year-old boy had once had when Jon had known him, which made no sense because all boys have brown hair except the ones who don't. "Rickon?" Davos said, and sat down abruptly as if his knees had discovered that they were mortal. "He's a Hellion. Do not expect him to bow when he should. Do not expect him to hold his temper. Do not expect him to do anything except love what he loves like a house on fire." Rickon did not bow. He did not need to. He ran with a shout down the length of the hall, and Jon met him halfway, and the world rushed in a sound that was like the sea and the inside of a shell. Behind the boy came a direwolf gray as cloud and silent as news. Shaggy Dog looked at Ghost, and Ghost looked back, and the hair on both their necks rose and then settled. The wolves touched noses. Men breathed out. Jon did not ask the question he most wanted to ask, that is, where is Bran? Because the answer might be a road he couldn't walk while he had a winter to keep. He did not ask about Osha until later, and when Davos told him she had died to keep the boy unbitten by Skagos as long as she could manage it, Jon grieved for a woman who had once told him truths he had not liked to hear. "Your lordship?" Wyman Manderly burbled, tears standing in his eyes and making him pink in a way that was almost comical. "A wolf in Winterfell, a real one. I am a stupid old man to be glad of it. But I am glad. Very, very glad." Jon found himself a steward by necessity and a guardian by choice. Rickon had edges that cut. He had a wildness in him that belonged to the woods and the way the wind sounded in the chimney after midnight. Jon did not try to break it. He placed men around the boy who knew when to shout and when to laugh and when to turn him toward work that tired the limbs and left the soul quiet. He set Rickon to learning the names of every man who slept within Winterfell's walls. He set him to mucking stalls and walking the parapets with the smith to learn where the mortar crumbled fastest. He told him stories of his father that did not make the man a saint. He let him rage and did not let him use that rage as a reason to harm anything smaller than he was. Sometimes at night he lay awake listening to Winterfell settle and told himself that what he had done was right. He had broken one vow to keep another. He had taken a name he had not been born to because it could shelter men who were born to nothing. He had bound himself to a king who might never sit a red chair in a sunny hall far to the south, because that king's laws made men walk more upright and treat girls less like livestock than the laws of the men who opposed him. He dreamed of ice sometimes, and in the ice he saw a red woman and a boy with blue eyes and a crown made of frost and the long shadow of a wall that reached from one end of the world to the other like a black finger pointing. He dreamed of his father with a sword across his knees and a woman with tears in her eyes and a smile that said she had been happy once before the world taught her not to expect that. He woke with Ghost at the foot of the bed and the weight of 1,000 lives on his chest. He tried not to resent them. They had not asked to be placed there. Letters came from the Vale, slippery as eels and twice as dangerous. A cousin wrote to say that a girl named Elaine had charmed every stone in the Eyrie into loving her, and the name tasted like ashes in Jon's mouth. He wrote back never, because some doors a man must not open if he wishes for the house to remain standing. The dead walked sometimes in the stories of men fleeing farmsteads along the King's Road, and that did not stay a story. One spring midnight a rider came pounding through Winterfell's open gates, a man with eyes like broken glass. "They found my brothers," he said in a hall full of firelight, breath wheezing as if he had run the whole way from the gift. But the cold had found them first. They still walked. They still walked. Jon assembled men like pieces of a puzzle he had been turning over for months now, making sure the corners were tight. He sent word to Eastwatch and Shadow Tower and Long Barrow and to every holdfast that had bothered to answer his letters when he'd offered wood in exchange for bowmen. He sent Tormund back to the wall with carts of pitch and bundles of arrows and sacks of salt. He sent Queen's men with him and Manderly men, and Karstark men who had a little less cold in their blood now that Alice wore a knife on her belt with a then's mark on its hilt. And then he went himself, with Ghost at his heels and 100 of the best men Winterfell could spare, up the King's Road under skies that had learned to be gentle in a limited way. He left Rickon weeping with anger and told him a truth that felt like a lie as he said it. "You are Lord of Winterfell until I return. The words matter only because the work matters. Do the work." They rode to the wall and saw what the night had made of it in the last months. It rose as it always had, impossible and inevitable, and the men upon it were as thin as their brothers had been when Jon left, but their eyes were different. They had seen what the dead do. It changes a man's gaze. Bowen Marsh did not embrace him or curse him. He looked at Jon as one looks at a stone set into a wall, one that perhaps you do not like the shape of, but that you know holds the rest. "Steady. You send wood," Bowen said. "More than I can count. You send food. You send men with northern blood who do what they are told and grumble at the right time and stop when asked. I hated you," he said slowly. "Then I hated myself for hating a man who kept my brothers alive. Then I stopped. We are simple men here, my lord. We like to think of things as true or false. You put me in a position where both can be true and false at once. I wish you had not, but here we are." "Here we are," Jon said. Melisandre climbed the steps that night and stood next to Jon against the north wind. "The shadows lengthen," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "This is what you were for. Not a throne of any color. Not a name. The fire does not care about names. It cares only about what burns." "I know," Jon said. He did not look at her. He looked at the night. "But men care about names. That's how you rally them to stand in front of what burns." Dawn broke thin and blue, and with it came a sound like 1,000 bones striking together a mile away. Men went very still. Ghost's hackles rose. The first of the dead appeared at the tree line, and they were not the worst of it. The worst of it were the pale figures that drifted among them like thought becoming action. The wall groaned as the gates were barred and winches turned. Men took places they had been assigned months ago because a man had sat in Winterfell and drawn up charts better than he had drawn up words, and then sent those charts north sewn into fat bags of grain. The first flight of arrows went up like a flock of black birds and fell among the dead like rain. The second lit up. The northern pitch burned brighter than the wall had seen in years. Men screamed and did not stop afterward because these were not men, and the sound a dead thing makes when it burns is not human and never was. Jon moved down the line, touching shoulders, speaking low because men lean in to hear low voices. He set himself where the line sagged. He sent Tormund where the men were fighting closest and where laughter could make a man forget his fear for the length of one breath. A figure on the far side of the world's end lifted a hand, and the dead below lifted theirs, and the arrows that had killed them rose with them. The absurdity of it would have been funny at another time and in another life. Jon found he was laughing, a dry, breathless chuckle. "That's cheating," he said. "Everything worth doing is, as long as you cheat the right side," Davos said. Jon had not even known he had come up the stairs beside him. He had probably been there for an hour. "See that you do." The battle did not break that day. Battles with winter rarely do. They dragged like an old man's breath, long and ragged, the lungs refusing to quit while they can still hold one spoon of air. When the dead fell, they rose. When they burned, they burned. When the pale figures set their cool attention on a single point, the wall itself seemed to stiffen in its ice and stone, and the men on it found that their hands stung and their eyes watered at the same time. What turned the day, if it turned at all, was not a stroke of a sword or a fall of a lord. It was a steady, stubborn series of small things. A boy of 12 who ran along the inside of the parapet carrying arrows until his legs shook and he vomited and then kept running, because someone had to. A Manderly man and a Horp man slapping each other into sense when panic tried to run them away from their positions. A Karstark woman who poured water into cooked oats until the pot was thin enough to stretch and thick enough to fill, and then delivered it herself to men who had not eaten since dawn, and took in return the words of a prayer she had not grown up to know. A southern queen with a bitter tongue who had, in this 1 hour, the grace to keep it behind her teeth and sing a lullaby to a dozen children whose mothers were on the wall pulling bowstrings. And Jon, who had to be everywhere and found that he could not be, and so learned the oldest lesson a Lord of Winterfell learns if he means to do the job and not merely play it. You trust. You trust and you check, and when you find a thing done well you say so where everyone can hear, and when you find a thing done ill you say little and fix it, and when you find a man drunk you pour him out and put someone else in his place. You kill only when you must and when it helps, and you remember that everything you kill leaves a shape where it stood that men will walk around for years as if it is still there. By the time the sky went from blue to black again, the dead had pulled back into the trees, as if the day had tired them and they needed to consider what it had taught. The wall breathed. It had groaned, and now it settled. Men slumped where they stood, and the sound of weeping rose, not because of grief only, but because of the release of tension in muscles that had been ironed for 12 hours. Jon looked to the north and felt no easing. He felt only the cold beyond cold and the stares of a dozen inhuman eyes and the understanding that the days ahead would be this day repeated, and worse, and less dramatic, and no one would write songs about them because songs cannot find the music of boredom and resilience. He smiled anyway, because the smile told the men near him that a human expression still had a place on a human face. "You have your work," he said to Bowen Marsh softly. "I'll have mine. We will do both until we fall down." Bowen's mouth twitched. "I am a man who likes to know where the edges are," he said. "You blur them until I want to strike you, and then you build a bridge and I walk across it." He looked out at the forest. "We will keep doing that as long as the trees stand." Jon returned to Winterfell with 50 fewer men than he had taken, and with a 1,000-yard stare that he tried to tuck into a drawer when he greeted Rickon, because boys notice. He did not succeed. Rick untouched his brother's cheek in a quick, rough gesture and then dragged him to the yard to see how Shaggy Dog had learned a new trick, which was to stand too still and make a man think the wolf was a statue, and then move like a storm. A letter waited on Jon's table, slipped among accounts and grain tallies and a careful list of arrow fletchings. The seal was smashed and the hand was one he had seen once long ago when a man with neat letters had signed his name in a book in Winterfell's library and smiled at a girl with auburn hair. The veil had begun to stir. A falcon had spread its wings, and a snake had coiled under it. Sansa, the letter implied between lines like threads that held the whole together, was a hinge now on which many doors swung. Jon closed his eyes. This is a house full of doors, he thought. I cannot open them all without letting the cold in. He went to the crypts again that night, and this time he did not stop at the first stair. He went all the way down to where deeper cold lived, and he stood before his father's stone without kneeling because he had not earned that and because kneeling is not always the shape of respect. He put his hand on the wolf at Eddard Stark's feet and spoke out loud, because sometimes a man needs the sound to make the thought real. I think I did right, he said, and I think I have no right to think it. I broke a law, kept a law. I made a new one. He smelled cooking and found he was hungry. He walked toward the hall with the ease of a man who has done what can be done for one day and will not borrow tomorrow's grief until it comes looking for him. Wyman Manderley's laugh rolled out into the yard, and the sound made him think of a hearth in a house when every storm outside has agreed to wait a while. He thought, perhaps that is all a lord is, a hearth. Not a sword, not a crown. A place where men can warm their hands and then go out again to fight. He stepped across the threshold and men looked up, and he lifted a hand and they nodded, and he took a place at the long table with a plate that would never be full enough and a mug that would never be empty long enough, and he ate with his men, and he told the boy from Hornwood a story about a blind mare that had once dragged him and Rob into the pond by the old oaks, and the boy laughed and choked on his bread, and Rickon thumped him on the back solemnly to keep him from dying, and the hall, filled with the kind of noise Winterfell had missed. Far to the south, a red chair waited in a sunny hall for a king who might not see it. Far to the north, a darkness breathed and took its measure once again. Between them stood a wall of stone and a man of winter who had learned how to wear a new name. The name fit awkwardly. Most true names do. He wore it anyway, the way a man wears mail he cannot yet carry easily, and if it bit into his skin in places, he did not complain. He went about the business of being a Stark. Spring would come one day, thin and reluctant and finally in a rush. Men would mistake it for rescue. It would not be rescue. It would be a reprieve, and reprieves are the kindest gifts the world offers. Jon learned to be grateful for them. He learned to bank his fire and count his bread and kiss his brother on the brow and say no to a woman who thought blood was a kind of coin. He learned to speak to men who hated him and to make use of their hate. He learned to love a castle the way you love a stubborn hound that will not come when you call but will run at your side when you set off without calling. He learned to do all this as if it were the song a man had been given to sing. On a morning when the air smelled like the very first thaw and the snow was the color of old linen, he stood on the wall of Winterfell and watched a column of men move like a thread across the white land. They were Stannis' men returning to gather bread for the next push. They looked smaller than they were. Everything looked smaller from the walls. He remembered how great the yard had been when he was a boy and how now it fitted in his eye easily. And he was struck by the foolishness of boys and the foolishness of men and the way both endure. A raven landed on the battlement near him, glossy as wet rock. Its eyes were clever, cocked its head and cried in a voice that sounded almost like a word. Jon held out his hand. The bird hopped onto his wrist and pecked at his sleeve to test the fabric. He thought of Maester Aemon and bowed his head for a breath. Then he tied the ribbon to the bird's leg with the note for Eastwatch that said simply, "Send Mortar and all your faith." The bird left his hand in a rush of wings and vanished into a sky that had remembered how to be blue. He stayed on the wall a long time after. The sun was a low coin. Ghost lay at his feet and sighed and rolled over to expose his belly to a weak patch of light. Jon looked at the land and saw in it a man's life. Rough, stubborn, full of hollows where a foot could break and slopes where the unwary slid. He thought about the choices he had made and the lives they had cost and the lives they had spared. He thought about how no some of those things ever adds up properly, and how a man lives anyway. When he went down into the yard, the world did not change. Men were still arguing about the best way to stack wet wood. Women were still thrashing rugs in the wind. A boy was learning to fall off a horse properly. A girl was learning to cut meat for stew without wasting the fat. The hearths burned. The wolves slept and woke and slept again. He found Rickon in the library with his head on his arms, snoring among scrolls. Jon laid his cloak across the boy's shoulders and stood for a moment looking down on him, and then left without waking him. Some acts of care are for the doer rather than the done to. He let himself have this one. The hall was brighter when he entered it again. He took up his place and listened to a man from Last Hearth tell a story about a cow that walked into the river in autumn and came out in spring with a calf at her side and a look on her face that said the world was a joke. He passed the ale and ate the stew and made plans to send the cow to a field with better grass, and later he went to the Godswood and set his hand against cold bark and whispered the names of all the lords of Winterfell who had worn the title like a crown and like a chain. He added his own name to the list, low and quickly, as if he were ashamed of it and proud. The wind stirred the branches overhead and the tree made that sound it makes, which is like nothing else in the world, and he smiled because for a breath he thought it might be answering him. He knew it was only the wind. Then he went back to the fire. There were letters to write. There were stores to count. There were men to bury and to marry and to knight and to set to work. There was winter to keep as if it were a beast on a leash and hungry enough to eat the world. There was his life, chosen and given and never entirely his, and he walked into it as a wolf walks into snow, leaving prints behind that others might step in, if they chose, and if not, that would be their choice too. He was Jon Stark now. He would be Jon Snow until he died. He had found a way to be both without breaking entirely. It was enough. It had to be. The night would come and he would meet it on the walls he had chosen, and if he fell, he would fall facing it. And that was the only kind of falling that had ever made sense to him.